All right, so we are here at Spring Lake. You can find this real close to Payson, Utah. It's actually right close to where my wife's family's from. Um, and we're here at Spring Lake to talk about a certain Indian chief. Here's his memorialized gravestone here at Spring Lake, and we have his name right there, Blackhawk. Um, so, some information about Blackhawk. Um, Obviously, very important to understand who Blackhawk is. The Blackhawk War was the biggest armed conflict that Utah saw in its history. Um, so, and of course, when we talk about that, we're comparing it to Utah's involvement in both of the world wars, and still, the Blackhawk War was a bigger conflict for Utah than either of those, as well as the Civil War. So we need to understand a little bit about why it happened, where it came from, who Blackhawk was, why we have this memorial here, how it came to be here, all of those things. So, first things first, when we first have the Mormon pioneers coming in 1847, obviously they come in direct contact with the Ute tribes of this area. So Sanpete County area, Utah County area, lots of Ute Indians living here. And as we'll be talking about in other contexts, whenever groups migrate from one place of the world to another, come in contact with new peoples, there's both good and bad to come from that, kind of a give and take. In the context of the Mormon pioneers meeting the natives here, obviously resolutions had to be made. When Utah was a territory, and even a bit before it became a territory, Brigham Young was in charge of Indian affairs for the Utah Territory. I think he was the Indian superintendent or commissioner or something like that. So he led that effort from somewhere around 1850 to 1857. Things changed in 1857 because at that point, Congress essentially stripped a bunch of titles from those who held offices in the Utah Territory and reappointed people from the East to travel out here and become the new leadership. And of course, this has a lot to do with some of the Utah War tensions going on in that same period of time. That moment at which Utah was presumed to be in a state of rebellion, and the United States was trying to subdue Utah. So, with all of that as context, the person who ends up the Indian superintendent is a man named O.H. Irish, Superintendent Irish. So this guy comes out to Utah and makes a few observations right off the bat. And I'm going to be reading a whole bunch of quotes because, again, it's important that we get the actual statements here if we're going to have any hope of understanding why the Blackhawk War happened. We've got to visit some of these primary sources. So, when Irish came to Utah, to the Uinta area, he makes an observation. He says, in a letter to Abraham Lincoln on October 3rd, Sir, I have the honor to submit for your consideration the recommendation that the Acting Commissioner of Indian Affairs, that the Uinta Valley in the territory of Utah be set apart and reserved for the use and occupancy of Indian tribes. So, right off the bat, he's making this recommendation to Lincoln and saying, we need to accommodate these native people and give them a land of their own in Utah, the Uinta area. We'll talk about how big that area was that he was stipulating in a minute. But he, as part of this recommendation, he wants to set aside and write up a formal treaty between them and the natives of the area. The president, obviously, he's getting this recommendation from Irish in 1861, late 1861, October of 1861. That's problematic for Lincoln, obviously, right? Because he doesn't have the time to bother with Indian troubles in the Utah Territory if he's trying to keep the nation from dividing itself in half. And 1861, it's really a crucial year of the Civil War, so he is fully distracted by everything going on with the southern Confederacy states, and consequently he just sort of in fact, the very day that he got the letter, he just wrote a reply that said, let the reservation be established as you recommend, Abraham Lincoln. So he's essentially like, look, I'm not dealing with this. You do it the way you want to do it. Just figure it out and leave me out of it. So, 3 years after that, so at this point we're talking 1864, right at the close of the Civil War, Congress provided for what was termed extinguishing the Indian title to Utah lands. So they submitted an act of Congress, essentially, that stipulated that the Indians of the Utah Territory, as specified there, designating the Uinta Valley, that their claimed titles to the land, specifically the farmable and mineable land of that area, would be extinguished. So they no longer have a title to that land, but they are given instead, in place of that, a permanent reservation in the Uinta Valley. Now this is important for us to look closely at, because it's a shift in the way that Congress was dealing with the Indians. Before this point, when Brigham Young was trying to handle the Indian settler conflicts, his efforts dealt more with assimilation than with reservation. So what I mean by assimilation is the act of one group of people trying to absorb another group of people. So he was of the opinion that he could set up what he called Indian farms. So they were kind of, you could think of them as like mini reservations, but they were temporary and they were meant to essentially provide the natives with civilization education. This is how you grow things, or the way that they stipulated you would grow the things that they're bringing. This is how you attended a civilized school. This is how you set up a, whatever. This is how you do things in civilized society. And when he's talking about civilized society, obviously he's talking about his society. So he's saying, his efforts were all about trying to get the Native Americans to adopt a more Anglo lifestyle, I suppose, a more white culture lifestyle, so that they could fully integrate with the white people instead of being separated. Congress at this point is shifting that whole effort on its nose and saying, instead of assimilating these people, let's give them reservations that are permanent, where they will stay for the duration of however long they wish. And they will run everything themselves, and this is where the reservation system really crops up. It's right in this period of time. So, with all of that, I'm going to share with you a few more statements here. When Superintendent Irish came to Utah Territory, this was what he wrote back to Congress. He said, the natives here are inhabiting that portion of the territory south of Great Salt Lake City, and they're all anxious to know whether the government proposes to enter into treaties with them. They are anxious to understand their rights. I would recommend that steps be taken to make treaties with the following tribes or bands of Indians through Utah, through the Utahs or the Utes, the Parvants, Paiutes, all of them, as soon as they can be congregated in the spring. So he's saying, make all haste. We need to establish this treaty. Before he really gets confirmation that this treaty can go forward, a very important event happens for what came to be called the Blackhawk War. This is really, I guess, what people think of as the starting point of that conflict. In early April of 1865, an Indian named Blackhawk and his companion Jake Arapeen, he was the son of Chief Wakara, who you'll recall from previous mentions of the Walker War. But Blackhawk and Jake Arapeen, they come to Manti to talk with John Lowry. Lowry is pretty sure that they're coming to talk to him because they want to apologize, because recently a group of natives apparently had slaughtered some 15 cattle owned by the settlers in the area, one of which was owned by himself. So he was basically expecting them to come apologize. However, what ended up happening is when they got there, Arapeen confronts Lowry and essentially blames the white people who have moved there for using their supernatural abilities to kill his father. His father, Chief Wakara, died of a disease. I think it was smallpox. I'm pretty sure it was smallpox. Yeah, he was convinced that it was all because the white people had done something to either anger their gods or had used some god of the East to cause this illness to come upon his father. So he's looking for retribution, for payback. Lowry responds to this by demanding compensation for the cattle that were killed. He's essentially like, well, I'm going to ignore that. How about the cattle that you guys legitimately killed that were ours? We want payment for that, and we deserve payment for that, and we're not going to just turn a blind eye. So at this point, Arapeen drew his bow and knocked an arrow and was essentially threatening to attack. And Lowry's response to that was to pull him by the hair from his horse. This is an extremely derogatory thing to do to anyone, let alone a native Ute. The native Utes they have very ritualistic importance to their hair and the way that they treat it. So it was a really, really poor move. But nevertheless, after this point, this is where we really start to see attacks and raids and battles happening, all as part of what we come to call the Blackhawk War. Part of the reason it starts to become called the Blackhawk War is because Blackhawk leads a lot of these raids. His parents had been killed by settlers. He had witnessed a lot of destitute living conditions for some of the natives in the area, and he was very concerned that the people from the east were coming and they were going to take everything, and our only recourse is to take things back. So his effort was typically centered around stealing cattle. There were battles and attacks and people were really killed, but his main focus really was trying to make the white people decide to leave by taking their means of living, which was in this area especially cattle, and it also provided them with the needed resources that they needed. So that's really what spirals into the Blackhawk War here. After this moment, as I was saying before, Irish finally gets permission from Congress to create a treaty with the Utes. So good timing. We can fix this whole problem right as it's beginning, is kind of how Irish feels. So he says, I therefore called the several bands of the Utah Indians to meet me at the Spanish Fork Indian Farm on the 6th of June. Governor Doty acted cordially with me in making the preliminary arrangements, but was taken suddenly ill in the evening before I started for the Indian farm. Brigham Young accepted my invitation. He has pursued so kindly and conciliatory a policy with the Indians that it has given him great influence over them. It was my duty and policy under your instructions to make use of his influence for the accomplishment of the purposes of the government. So, Irish and Brigham Young are going to meet to establish this treaty with the Native Americans. And once they meet, they have representatives of the Yampa, the Pavants, the Sandpitch Indians, the Timpanogos, the Utes, few others as well. Chiefs and notables from each of those. When the treaty is stipulated, essentially what they're told in the treaty is that they agree to relocate to the Uinta area, which actually in this treaty was an established area of like some 2 million miles near Green River. So it was actually a real big chunk of Utah. In payment for their relocation and loss of the land that they were currently on, the United States stipulated to pay like $25,000 a year for 10 years, and then $20,000 for 20 years, and then $15,000 for 30 years, and then certain payments to set up houses and schools and different things like that on the reservation itself. So after they stipulated this treaty, there was some uneasiness amongst the few of the native leadership here, One of those chiefs, his name is Chief Kanash, he said, "If the Americans buy the land, where would the Mormons who live here go?" So this is an important thing to understand here. The Native Americans are regarding the Mormons as separate from the Americans, which makes sense because the Mormons fled American territory and set up their own land in Utah. So they distanced themselves from being considered Americans right from the start. So now that the government is sending people from the east to establish this treaty, Congress has stipulated that this will happen. They're referred to as Americans. The Mormons are not. The Mormons are referred to as Mormons. So he says, if the Americans buy the land, where would the Mormons who live here go? Will the Lord take them up to his country? I think this is the Mormons' land, the bishop's land. With the Utes, let them all live here together. I do not want to cut the land in two. Let it all remain as it is. So he's saying, if you're sending us to a reservation, where are you going to send the Mormons? And if you're not sending them anywhere, then why are you sending us somewhere? That doesn't make any sense. So he's saying, I don't like this reservation idea. Me and my people are fine living with you and yours. Let's just find peace. That's what Chief Kanash is saying. He continues, it is all right to let us stay where we are. Let me stay at Corn Creek and visit back and forth. Suppose Brigham Young, our eldest brother, was to die, where would the Indians all run to? When we know he is at Salt Lake City, it is all right. Brigham is the great captain of all, for he does not get mad when he hears of his brothers and friends being killed, as the California captains do. The best thing is for the superintendent to give us our blankets and shirts, and not talk about trading the land, but let us live and be friendly together. Give all of us blankets and shirts, squaws and all, and do not make us feel poor, but clothe us up. So again, he's saying, why are you trying to buy us off here? We can just be friends. Just if we need something, provide it, because out of humanly care, because you care about us the way you care about your own people. And he explains, I guess, some of the reason why Brigham Young has so much sway with these Native Americans is because he's established himself as trustworthy, right? They believe that if they have credible reasons to be upset about something, they can go to Brigham Young about it and he'll actually listen to them. They're not confident that that will be the case if someone else is to take his place. So then the chief of the Sand Pitch rose to speak. He said, I do not question the paper, but I do not want to trade the land nor the title to the land. It used to be the Lord's land, but now it is the Mormons' land and our land. The maker of the land is probably dead and buried now, but this is good, heavy land, lots of water and rocks, and I want it to stay here and for us to stay with it. The whites make farms, get wood, and live here on the land, and we never traded the land. Let them live here and let us live here too. So he's kind of echoing the same sentiment. We can work things out with the Mormons that are already here. We don't want the Americans coming and ruining that. And he continues, if the talk is for us to trade the land in order to get the presents, I do not want any blankets or any clothing. I would rather go without than to give up my title to the land I occupy. So, this highlights a very important thing too. The fact that these Ute Indians, Native Americans, they felt very connected to their land, and they had a different concept of land ownership, as is kind of clarified in here, right? They are claiming this used to be the land of our God, and now it is the land that both we and the Mormons inhabit together, and it's kind of a communal share. We just all share it together. that's a very different concept of land ownership than what people are used to coming from the East, where people have private property that you cannot trespass on. After these concerns were voiced, Brigham Young was asked to speak his mind. So he rose and he said, Sandpitch, Soyet, Tabby, these are all names of some of the chiefs that were there. All of you, I want you to understand what I say to you. I'm looking for your welfare. If you do not sell your land to the government, they will take it, whether you are willing to sell it or not. This is the way they have done in California and Oregon. If you go to Uinta, they will build your house, make you a farm, give you cows, oxen, clothing, blankets, and many other things you want. And then the treaty that Colonel Irish has here gives you the privilege of coming back here on a visit. You can fish, hunt, pick berries, dig roots, all of those things. The land does not belong to you, nor to me, nor to the government. It belongs to the Lord. But our Father at Washington is disposed to make you liberal presents to let the Mormons live here and other Americans. If you will go over there and have your houses built and get your property and money, we are perfectly willing you should visit with us. Do you understand? Kanash says we do. Young says, we feel to do good to you, and I know that this treaty is just as liberal and does everything for you and for your people that can be done. Now, if you can understand this, you can see at once that we do not want anything to wrong any of you. So, Brigham Young is explaining to them, look, you should be grateful that the Americans coming from the East are offering you money at all. It's interesting that this is coming from Brigham Young, right? Because he has firsthand experience of the American government pushing his people out of their land by force, right? And they didn't pay the Mormons to leave. They forced them to leave. So it makes sense that he would make this claim to them. Not only is he talking in that context, but he's also citing what happened in Oregon and California, which is what happened. He is convinced that if they don't take the money now, they're not going to get anything for it, and the American government will still just come and take it from them. So he's saying, look, get the best deal you can, take it while it's offered. This is what you want. After he spoke, the oldest chief shared his remarks. His name was Soyet. So he said, I am the father of you all. I have always been a friend to the Americans. I have never thrown away my friendship for the Americans. After a while, Brigham and the Mormons came here. I saw him, and he was my son, my friend. When I met Brigham Young, we talked and understood each other, me and my children, the Utahs, and Brigham and his children. When some of my children stole horses and acted badly, did I break my friendship? No, never. I do not want to see it. I am old. My heart is very weak now, but it is good. So he's again essentially saying, look, if this is what Brigham Young says is the right thing to do, maybe we should just do it, because he has always been a friend to me. I've always treated him as a friend, so we should just trust this. You can kind of see what's being built up here, right? It's kind of obvious what's about to happen. But the next morning they slept on it, and the next morning everyone came back except for Chief Sandpitch, who refused to come back. He was the one who didn't want to give up his title to the land he felt connected to. But every one of the other chiefs came back and agreed, saying, it is good, we will sign. So the treaty was signed by all but the one, and afterward, they were promised, all of the things stipulated in the treaty, given some immediate presents as a promise of goodwill. And what ended up happening after that is unfortunate. So right after getting this finalized, Irish basically renounces his position as Indian Commission superintendent guy. So he's replaced by someone else, and another 2 years passes, and then he writes, "The treaty has never been confirmed, nor has any action been had regarding it. Although it has been repeatedly explained to the Indians that the treaty was not binding until ratified by the Senate, they do not seem to comprehend the matter and are much dissatisfied that it is not in effective operation." So we know that although the Indians have probably already been pushed to the reservation land and their other lands taken, they probably also have not received payment for it yet, as is explained there, because it hasn't been ratified. And he continues, "I have heretofore repeatedly urged that some action be had relative to this treaty. It is impossible to make the Indians fully comprehend the reason why." So, at this point, as you heard in those previous statements, the treaty has not been ratified. It's been a few years, no payments have been made, no ratification has been done by Congress, by the Senate. And since the Senate has not ratified the treaty, it's not in full force, so they're not going to get their money until it is. So this new commissioner keeps pushing and pushing. We need to get this ball rolling. They're getting anxious and antsy, and Blackhawk War is in full force right now. Definitely fueled by the fact that they have not received a penny for what they were promised. And so the natives are just fed up with everything, and Blackhawk especially. He's making sure that everyone hears just how fed up he and they are with everything. Eventually, the inquiries finally reach the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, A.G. Taylor, in 1869. His response is, "The ratification of the treaty with the Utah tribes has been repeatedly urged by this office, as under its provisions measures could be adopted for the concentration of the Indians to the territory upon the ample reservations set apart for their use and occupancy, and the necessary means afforded for their support and improvement. It is possible that a better treaty can be made under present circumstances and relations of these Indians, and I suggest that it would be as well, perhaps, that the Senate do not advise the ratification of the pending treaty, in which event I would recommend that early steps be taken to negotiate a new one." So he's essentially saying, I don't know that we should sign on this treaty. I think we could expect more for less from these Native Americans. We can get a better deal for us. So let's scrap the treaty. Don't even push for it to be ratified. We'll just write a new one. And so that's essentially what happens. That the Senate is advised on it and votes to not ratify, and it's kind of filed away, and it is never seen again. So you can see how after all of that, there was plenty for the Utes of this area to feel anxious about and angry about. Obviously, the people who ended up taking the brute front of this war ended up being the Mormons that lived here, because obviously they're the ones here. So Blackhawk and his people concentrated their efforts at raids and attacks on Mormon settlements. in the throng of the war, really in the worst part of the war, which is in the early 1860s, Brigham Young has these Mormon settlements put up a whole bunch of forts, a lot of which you can probably still see remains of all over the place. But needless to say, by I believe it was 1868, Blackhawk was finished fighting. Part of the reason was because there was a big battle in which he got hurt and he never fully recovered. He was on his way out and he just didn't want to leave his people in the position of fighting a battle that he felt like he was supposed to own. He didn't want anyone else to pay the price for it. He wanted to be the one to do it, and since he was leaving, since he was dying, he wanted to just make peace and be done with it. So that's what he does. He proposes to make peace with the Mormon settlements of the area, and retreats to the reservation. Eventually he does end up coming back to this spot, Spring Lake, near Payson, Utah. This is where he grew up. He felt very fondly toward this area in particular. This is where he ended up dying. If you can see the mountains in the back here next to Spring Lake, his body was first buried right at the base of the mountains over there. And, you know, ritual burial and all of that by the women of his family. And sadly, in the early 1900s, during some mining work, his body was exhumed by some miners who recognized his burial site and ended up submitting his remains for display in a university museum here in the state. But then his remains ended up being lost in processing eventually over the years. And interestingly enough, it wasn't until somewhere around 2002 that a young Boy Scout from this area was planning an eagle project. So he's, you know, not very old. He's probably just a high school student. And he decides he wants to locate the lost remains of Blackhawk, who's important to this area. So he does a bunch of research and ends up finding out that they're hidden away in some deep, dark basement somewhere. And he was able to restore the remains to Blackhawk's family, and they set up to rebury him and hold a memorial service and everything to give him a proper burial here in this area back at the place that he grew up in, Spring Lake. So official end of the Blackhawk War isn't really marked until 1872, mostly because even after Blackhawk's efforts at peace and his passing, there were still skirmishes and things that didn't end until Congress finally actually sent federal troops, a set of maybe 200, to come and cease the rebelling natives' movements and things like that. Another interesting side note about what comes out of this conflict, not only do we now have a very clear path toward reservation-style treatment to the Native Americans, but we also ended up with the native ghost dances of the Ute people, and more specifically, or less specifically, I guess, just the natives of the Utah area. Apparently they held a massive ghost dance, first of its kind, that we know of, in northern Utah area. Might have been southern Idaho actually, maybe, but they congregated a whole bunch of Native Americans at the same time to contact their dead. Actually, according to the legend of the event, they were trying to contact someone they referred to as the voice of the prophet of the West, who was some ancient figure of Indian folklore, but they stipulated to their native neighbors, their Native American neighbors, that if they didn't attend and assist in this ghost dance in an effort to communicate with this prophet voice, then they'd essentially be doomed in the afterlife or something. So basically, long story short, a whole bunch of Indians came into one place, and it spooked a whole bunch of the settlers in the area, because they felt like it was just another Blackhawk War starting, only they were congregating into a massive army. So the U.S. ended up sending troops again to break that up, because they were scared of it, even though the Indians never really intended to cause any trouble for anybody. But needless to say, they were unsuccessful in contacting their prophet voice of the West, who, according to the legend, was supposed to tell them what their place is in America at this point. They were looking for direction from this prophet voice, and because they were not able to complete the ritual or contact him or whatever, ghost dances are still held, and I'm pretty sure that it's under that same stipulation, same effort to commune with the dead, seeking direction and guidance and all of those things. So kind of an interesting tie into a ritual that most people recognize the name of when they hear, like, ghost dances. Oh yeah, that's a Native American thing. So again, just to close, this is Blackhawk's memorial site. He's a very important figure in understanding Native American and American relations and how that all pans out, as well as, especially for Utah, the Mormon and Native American relation. But you're free to come and visit this. There's stuff to read on the memorial. There's fun view, and people enjoy the lake here. But sorry for the long one, but this is a really key moment for Utah history. We really need to make sure we understand Blackhawk War. Best wishes to you guys.